Kane Apache on the line with us from the stream who won the lesson for free, and you guys are all privy to watch it. So let's begin. All right. So everyone always knows that controlling the center is one of the most important things in chess, but the reason it's important is why. You know, like, people say, okay, center is important to control, but do people really understand why it's important to control? So do you maybe have any insight as to why it's important to control the center in a game of chess?
Are you asking me, or is that a...
Oh, I'm asking you. You're getting the lesson, so.
All right. I'm going to go with the center is important because it's controls most of the large diagonals. It's where your knights want to be to get the most action.
True. Also, how about disruption of the enemy's forces as well? So the more you're in the center, the harder it's going to be for your opponent to coordinate because their units will kind of be disjointed, right?
Right, it'll be divided and
yeah, exactly.
go down the sides.
Exactly. So what's a potential drawback of controlling the center?
Perhaps you overextend, or...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So usually when we speak of controlling the center, we usually mean controlling it with pawns, because when you control it with pieces, it's somewhat temporary, because pieces can always be chased away, but pawns are more of a fixed thing. So controlling the center usually means either occupying with pawns or supporting it with pawn advances. So the further you advance your pawns in the center, the more you control it, but conversely, the further you advance your pawns in the center, at the same time, your pawns will start to lose touch with your other pawns and your other pieces, and they might become, exactly like you said, too overextended. So let's look at an example of how this might work. So we're going to look at an Alakin, which is one of the classic examples of letting white build up a big center. But
doesn't go C, yeah.
Yeah, so okay. So already look, white has this beautiful center, and black has not even moved the pawn yet, right? So black's idea is that he's going to let white create this huge center, but he's going to try to slowly chip away at it and prove that it's overextended. Whereas white's just saying, okay, you let me have a center, I'm just going to take it. So d6, and now white continues to build his center with f4. But however, okay, so f4 obviously, strengthens his control of the center, particularly the e5 square. But okay, what squares does this f4 push weaken
now? E4.
Yeah, and what else?
G4.
Sure, and what else?
E3.
Yeah, very
I
good.
Guess.
Yeah, E3, exactly.
Yeah.
So E3 and E4 are now weakened. So basically, if an enemy piece lands on E4 or E3, there's no way for us to chase away with a pawn, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we just have to be careful that we don't allow this to come back and hurt us. Okay, so black takes, white takes. And now black plays c5. So the idea of playing c5 is to force these pawns to advance to such a point where they can't really defend themselves. So now really the only thing white can do to help maintain the center is to play d5, and now this point is weakened because now d5 had to have been played, and now black's starting to gain a hold on the dark squares by playing c5. So usually when you play a pawn move to a color square, you usually start to control those same colored squares. So now e6, and now the attractive move d6, which looks like it gets really into the heart of black's camp with this strong passed pawn, actually is a bad move. And can you tell me why d6 is a bad move here?
F6.
F6 does undermine the center, but actually e6 actually had a stronger threat. So what can black play here? What did black open up with e6?
C6.
Yeah, okay, but what pieces did black open up when he played e6? So what did black unleash when he played e6?
The queen.
So after d6, what can black play?
Queen h4 check.
Very good. Yeah. And now if g3, how does white win, or how does black win a rook here?
Oh, e4,
Yeah,
queen
very
e4
good.
check.
Yeah, so queen e4 wins a rook. So basically, after queen h4, white would have to play something like king to d2, and now this pawn hangs, right?
Yep.
So this is just over. So white can't rush in too much because right now white's only made pawn moves. So white has to kind of defend against queen h4 check. So white plays knight to c3. So the idea of knight c3 is to defend against this e4 square, so that if queen h4 check, white can play g3 safely. So after knight c3, well, what black plays pawn takes pawn. Now we want to keep our center as intact as possible. So we recapture, and now we got this nice pawn center. However, if you notice, there's no pawns on this file or on this file, so these pawns are basically going solo now. They basically have to they only can depend on each other for support. They have no other way, no other pawns that can support them. Of course, pieces can support them, um, but if they want to be supported by a pawn, they only have each other for support. And so that's kind of dangerous because if ever this pawn pushes to say d6, it weakens this whole complex of light squares. And conversely, if white ever plays e6, then this whole dark square complex is weakened. So these are known as what's called hanging pawns because they're on open files together and there's no pawns on either file adjacent to them. So it's a very specific type of structure that has benefits for white in that he has more space and a lot of activity, but the drawback is that if the pawns are forced to kind of be one rank apart, then it can create weaknesses. So all right, so d5, e6, knight c3, e5, cd5, and now queen h4, g3, and queen d4. So now black's trying to surround white's pawns with his pieces, but white has a surprise in store. So bishop b5 check, and now black made a weak move in playing bishop d7. And now white's attack starts to break through. So the question is, how does white continue his attack here?
Okay.
So this is important. You'll see why bishop d7 is weak in a second, tricky knight, by the way. So it's important to note that white's attacking here.
Right.
So that should clue us in at least to one thing that we should be doing.
Right. I don't know. Maybe the e6 push.
hmm So the e6 push will indeed end up being decisive. However, it's slightly premature now simply because it loses its efficacy if the queens are traded.
Okay.
So what's the best way to avoid a queen trade? So the reason I said that we should be clued in to avoid a queen trade is because we're attacking. And usually when we're attacking, it means that we want to keep pieces on the board, particularly the queens, because the queens are often,
Right.
a strong attacking piece. So how would we avoid a trade of queens here, but also uh, continue our attack? So what's the best square for the queen?
Either f3 or h5.
Okay,
I
well,
guess.
remember you said you want
Or
to
no,
support e6, right? So is there a way we can support e6 with our queen?
e2.
Yeah, very good. So queen
There.
e2. So it looks like a very simple move, just moving the queen out of capture. But more importantly, we're also on this diagonal and also on this file. And now e6 is really starting to gain some steam. So after queen e2, black thought he could play knight takes d5. But now, how does white win?
Hmm. Can we still do the e6 push, or would that
Yeah,
be bad
no,
now?
that's exactly right. So yeah, it
Okay.
requires some calculation, but it indeed does win by force. Because now the idea is uh, if this pawn takes, we have queen takes, and this bishop is pinned,
hmm
and it's going to be hard for black to avoid losing material there. So black took on b5. We recapture with a knight, so now we're threatening this as well as this type of thing. So queen b4, we just attack the queen again. And after queen takes b2, e takes f7, king takes f7, and now what's the move here for white?
Mm, knight f4 or queen f4.
Being queen f3?
Yeah, that's what
Well,
I mean.
be careful. If queen f3, black can maybe defend with knight f6. So there's actually a place
Right.
we can move with the queens that's even stronger.
Um,
But you have the right idea. You do have the right idea.
h5.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Queen h5. So now we're forking the king and we're forking the knight. I mean, obviously a rook is hanging, but this attack is irresistible. Because if g6, the point is
Then you just take the
with
knight.
check. Right, exactly. And then we have time for bishop c3, which defends everything. So that's exactly why. So the king, and if king g8, actually this is just mate. So,
Yep.
so the king probably has to, step up in the pocket to f6, and then, there's like bishop g5 check. There's all sorts of craziness. I mean, you can just play rook d1 simply, and this king is really not in good shape. So, so yeah, basically black resigns here. So the center basically triumphed because we were able to break open uh, black's uncastled king before he got a chance to even develop his pieces. Okay, so that's the triumph of the center. So now let's look at something a little different. So, queen's given accepted, where takes c4, bishop f5. So again, black is fighting to, fighting white to, white wants to play e4 and control the center, so black's fighting for those squares. So you notice how black has this logical plan of keeping his pieces attacking light squares. So c6, attacks b5 and d5. This knight attacks d5 and e4, and his bishop's coming out to attack e4. So he has a very logical plan. So oftentimes in the opening, black can't really fight for all the central squares, but he can fight for a share of them by amassing his pieces in a logical fashion to kind of control a complex of squares. So you see how all of black's pieces right now are kind of controlling the light squares as much as possible.
Yep.
But unfortunately for black, he's not going to be able to stop e4 for very long. So knight c3, knight bd7, g3, knight e4, bishop g2, knight d6. So now, queen a4, moving the queen out of take, knight b6. So again, black's trying to control these squares with his knights. So knights are on dark, controlling light squares. So knights always control squares that are in the opposite color of the squares in which they sit. So knight b6, queen d1, queen c8. Again, still trying to control light squares. So he wants to exchange these bishops to further strengthen his control on the light squares. So queen c8, castle, bishop h3, and now white finally gets to control the center with e4.
Hmm.
So bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and again, white's completely got his objective of controlling the center, and these knights are actually kind of awkward now, unfortunately for black. So again, black tries to kind of stem the tide and really overprotect this control of this square. But now the question is, what should white play here in this position? So
Well,
what do you think?
we could try to put the rook on e1, maybe develop the dark squared bishop, perhaps push a pawn.
Yeah, so basically it's kind of a stylistic choice between whether we want to try to make the use of the center have an immediate impact or whether we want to try to systematically build up.
Right.
So which one would you prefer? So I guess you're saying you'd prefer rook e1, which is kind of like a slow build up, which is perfectly fine. But in
Yeah.
the game, I think white was trying to be a little bit more violent about it. So white played d5 right away. So the
Yeah, I
idea
was
of
thinking doing
d5,
that after the rook.
right? So the idea of d5 is since white's better developed, he wants to try to rip open the center again before black is able to castle. So any capture by black will just open lines to either his queen on c8 or his king on e8. So black